to this online lecture and conversation with Dr. Fiona Wright. We are very, very lucky to have the opportunity to study her brilliant book, Domestic Interior. And Fiona's kindly agreed to speak to us today about the book, about the composition of the book, but also more broadly about some of the issues that we've been looking at in this course, which sort of fee for your kind of elucidation. It's a course about contemporary Australian voices and more broadly the kind of publishing scene, the performance of authorship. And I think your career is a really fascinating one to talk about in that respect, because you started as a poet. Well, you also started really as a literary editor, didn't you? I mean, before you published your first book. Could you talk a little bit about how you came into writing?
Well, I've been publishing poems for a while before I started editing. So I think the very first poems I ever wrote were at school. And no, I'm Sydney based, and the year that I went through my final year at school, the syllabus had suddenly expanded to have an English subject where you could make something the way you already could in visual arts or drama or... No, just visual arts and drama, really. And I started writing poems for that. And I'd never really written poems before or looked at poems before. And in fact, it's become a bit of a joke in my family now that at school I used to always complain that I was no good at writing or no good at creative writing. And in hindsight, I know that's because so much of every time you sit down to do a creative writing task in high school, it's generally write a short story about something, and I still can't write short stories.
They're tough. I think they're the hardest. I think they're the hardest form, other than poems. For non-poets. I think for non-poets, poetry is just the most terrifying thing. But short stories, good short stories, are really tough. So you're not alone.
Like, plot makes no sense to me in the world, let alone like in a book. Anyway. Dialogue's a terrible thing too. So I started there, and I think I was also very, very lucky that the very first poem I sent out in the world got picked up by VoiceWorks when I was 18 or 19. And I know how unusual that is. Like, normally you send out a mountain of poems before anything gets picked up, and you've got to be determined. I just got really lucky. And then, like, after that first poem was published, I then sent out a mountain of poems that got rejected here, there, and everywhere. But I think getting that first one in early really gave me a little bit of a
confidence boost.
Just enough hope.
Yeah.
Just enough hope to keep going. But it was getting started was really strange, because I'm from a long line of doctors, nurses, and policemen. I think there's one speech therapist in the family, but everybody else is a doctor, a nurse, or a policeman.
It's amazing.
Sorry, not doctor, a teacher, a nurse, or a policeman. And, they're all jobs that have a very specific path into them and career progression.
And perceived utility, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Yep. And, paychecks.
Yeah.
There are things. There's none of that around writing, and I didn't know any writers or really any people with creative jobs at all. So it was weird starting out. But the two things that really helped was I had a poem picked up by the Red Room Company in one of their very early projects. And at the time, it was just Joanna Featherstone, I think she's not the artistic director anymore, but she was the founder, and she ran it there for many years. She was doing it all by herself. And it was just before I was doing a journalism degree, which, was because the world's always going to need journalists. That's a really secure job that you can have.
It once seemed that way, didn't it?
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And as part of that, we had to do an internship. And I was already quite fed up with journalism as a concept. So I asked if I could do the internship with Joanna at Red Room.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. And she was thrilled because she didn't have anyone to help out and couldn't afford to pay anybody. And I was thrilled because I wasn't allowed to get paid and just wanted to help out. So, and I ended up staying there for a good sort of 3 or 4 years, just helping on the projects, and that was really my first introduction to other writers, other ways of making art, I suppose, and other kinds of jobs that you can have to support writing, and also what it might mean to have a writing practice. I don't think I really had a good sense of that yet. And I do think that, you know, the bit where you start meeting other writers and talking with other writers is really, really important.
Did you have particular? I mean, one of the things that the students do in this unit in one of their assignments, they can look at the relationship between a writer and either another writer, like a mentor, or a particular journal, or a particular publisher, or a specific editor. You know, to consider the ways in which literature is not just a solo pursuit. Have you had particular? Is there? When I say that, is there a relationship that stands out in your mind over your writing career that's been the most significant to you, or that you feel has shaped your work?
I mean, early on, working with Joanna was invaluable, and you know, I really learnt a lot there. But also, Ivor and Dick at Giramondo has been very important to me too. So, you know, that was my first job in publishing, was working with Ivor on Heat, the journal that sadly doesn't exist anymore and that I still miss. But
me too.
Yeah,
it was a terrific journal. I feel like we're speaking to a group of students who won't have heard of Heat, but back in the day, Heat and Meanjin were the premier, the most prestigious places to publish in Australian literature. And we can maybe circle back to think about how interesting it is that Heat is gone, but VoiceWorks is still around and Red Room is still around. It's interesting to have that sort of long view. But yeah, Heat was such a terrific journal, and I miss it too.
And doing stuff that some of the other journals weren't. And it's funny, I was thinking about it recently that it was really the first time I read essays, and was really interested in essays that, and I think they used to say, bridge the gap between the academic and the kind of, what was the word? Well, the literary, or the kind of trying to bring writing that's a little bit scholarly into kind of
a literary style almost, right?
Yeah. And I think I must have absorbed that without really being aware of it at the time, because it's very much the sort of essays that I write now would have been very at home there. But you know, so I started there working a couple of days a week on Heat, and then somebody else was working on the book production, and she left, and I took over her role as well. So I was doing book production as well as working on Heat.
And that was for Giramondo's, predominantly for their poetry list, is that right, Fiona, or was it for all books?
Originally it was for all books. You know, and that's such an interesting process. I think working on Heat really taught me a lot about how magazine publishing works, and about like exactly what a slush pile looks like. I remember that being quite a shock.
Could you describe that for our students, what the slush pile looked like at Giramondo?
It was huge. And this was just before online submissions became a thing too. So we'd actually literally get people posting in printouts. And you also had to put in a very cute a stamped self-addressed envelope for your rejection slip to come back to you. So you knew that if you got a letter in the post with your own handwriting on it, that
there's
it was
news.
bad news. But you know, I remember that's not a good indication. Poor medium for this, but I remember seeing the size of the first one, and of course it had been neglected for a few months because there was so much else going on, and it would have been close to 30 centimeters high, and these were like 2-page, 3-page printouts, and it was my job to go through them over the next couple of weeks, and I was just like, this is why I get a lot of rejections.
Yeah, and you know, that's something that you don't understand when you start out, is it is sort of a numbers game, you know, and if you bow out and you don't send your work out because you get knocked back once or twice or 10 times, you know, you can't get something published if you haven't sent it out, you know.
Yeah. And the other one I always say that I learnt on the back of that is that if you do get a personalised rejection, that genuinely means something. You know, if the editor writes to you, we really liked this, but we couldn't fit it in, we couldn't make it work, it was too similar to something else we had, please send us more things. They're not saying that just to be nice.
No.
Because they've got 30 centimetres of other stuff to go through. They're not going to encourage you to send them more and waste their time.
No, and as an editor, I can say absolutely that would be the absolute minority of rejections that you send would be ones that even have any personalised kind of quality to them. So you worked at Giramondo sort of shepherding these books into print. And then you were simultaneously publishing your own poems and starting to get a manuscript together. Is that sort of?
And I was still writing and sending poems out at the time, and then the period where I was there coincided with a lot of work so Giramondo is based at the University of Western Sydney, and has been for a while now. And it's a very interesting university because part of its remit is to work with the community. You know, Western Sydney is a very particular part of Sydney. It's geographically distant from most of the arts infrastructure in the city. It's culturally diverse. It's got a history of being kind of quite working class. So there's been a lot of projects come out of the uni about fostering various types of community and arts projects and health projects and those kinds of things in the area. So while I was there, the university was working on a project about creating literature in Western Sydney, and part of that was a set of writing groups that I joined, and Ivor kind of insisted that I joined. I wasn't going to because I was like, oh, no, it's, you know, give it to people who need it, which, you know, typical woman is what I think of that now. You know, because I was and am from that broader region, publisher as well, which kind of made that process a lot easier than it might have been otherwise, especially for poetry. It can be very hard to get poetry published.
Absolutely.
In this country.
Do you see a difference now? This is taking a slight angle, but do you see a difference now? I'm curious in the ways in which first books come to press and in the kinds of, I guess the thing I'm interested in is also the performance of authorship. I think there's an onus now. Like, I think you and I started publishing probably in the same zone. I'm not sure exactly what the age difference is between us. Not much, I think. I think we were probably roughly contemporaries. And so we published our first books a while ago. And now I do feel as though there's more of an onus to have a public persona than there was, you know, and to perform your authorship in certain ways, whether it's having a Twitter, having a website. Do you think that has actually changed since we started out?
I don't know. I actually think it's just that those things are possible now in a way that they weren't when we started out. I mean, Facebook was a thing, and I mostly used it to play Scrabble. And otherwise waste time. So I guess in that sense, not much has changed. But Instagram certainly wasn't. I don't think Twitter definitely wasn't around yet.
No.
So the kind of sense of a public self wasn't. There weren't as many ways to perform it as there are now. And I know lots of writers who are great on social media and who really have a strong presence and work really hard to kind of curate that presence. Curate's the word I like. And I know others who aren't interested at all. And I think that's a really good way to approach it. If social media is something that you like, because you're a monster, something that you like and you're good at and kind of works for you, then go for it. If it's something that you hate, you're going to do it poorly. So there's no point. I still think that the writing is the important thing.
I think that's an attitude that, you know, we're able to hold probably more so as poets, because poets sort of frown on it in a way.
Well, poets aren't and never going to feel any pressure to be commercial anyway, because
that's right.
We're not. Like,
right.
Which is kind of one of the it's a strange thing about poetry, and I also think it's one of the best and worst things about being a poet, that you don't have to deal with any commercial pressures at all, except you also have to find other ways to feed yourself and put a roof over your head.
That's right. Have you noticed a difference? So, you started out as a poet, and then you started publishing essays, and then you have, 2 books in each kind of genre. Have you noticed a difference in the way in which you've been received as a non-fiction author? I mean, I think I know the answer to this question, and I suspect the answer is yes. But I'm curious for you to maybe tease out, if you have any thoughts about what that might mean about what we value in Australian kind of cultural life. Do you feel more valued, I suppose, as a non-fiction writer than as a poet?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the kind of the way I normally think about it is, when my first book of essays came out, all I'd ever done up until that point was publish poetry. I'd sort of published 1 or 2 of those essays, but hadn't really kind of put many of them out there. Mm. And I genuinely expected the reaction to that book to be the same as the reaction to a poetry book, where it goes out into the world, other poets read it,
gets reviewed a couple of times, and that's,
and it's all very nice, and then life continues as normal. So that's what I was expecting, and that is absolutely not what happened. And I'm grateful for that. It was, it has been very helpful, and it's made all of the kind of work side of writing easier. But it got quite a bit of attention. I was invited to all of the writers' festivals. Right.
Unheard of for a poet, just for the students who are listening to this, unheard of for poets to be invited to all of them.
Yes. The year that Domestic Interior came out, for example, my home festival, the Sydney Writers' Festival, put me on one panel, but I was there as a moderator and as a writer.
I mean, we'll save that conversation for festival programming for another chat, but I hear you loud and clear. So as a non-fiction writer, you felt like, there's a sort of seriousness accorded to what you do. But interestingly, I was thinking about your subjects, and they're not distant. You kind of approach certain topics like anorexia, and those sort of personal kind of aspects of your work through both poetry and prose. And I'm curious to know, are there certain things that you find easier to do in poetry? Are there certain things that you think, no, that's an essay? How do you, because you're equally, I think, comfortable in both forms. You're equally proficient. You're excellent in both forms. How do you decide when something's a poem or when it's an essay?
I think they have a different kind of energy or a different kind of thinking. That what I like about poems is that they're so good at capturing moments, or really dwelling on something and thinking a small thing, thinking about, that's a better word, thinking about something. And essays I think of as a thinking through. Mm-hmm. And which is not to say that you need to resolve anything, because I like them because you don't have to resolve things, but it's kind of a longer, obviously it's longer, you're not sort of just sticking in a moment, you're going a lot further and broader, not necessarily broader, but you're following that train of thought wherever it leads you, rather than kind of sticking with it.
To me, I think of essays as kind of performing thinking, if that makes sense. That you actually kind of you experience reading an essay, the performance of the thought process. Not necessarily to an end point or to a decision or an epiphany, but just whereas the poem to me, as you say, maybe is more of a moment. I mean, that's probably a very lyric poet thing of you and I to say, that would make sense in both of our works, I suppose. But the poem has a more condensed kind of canvas where that kind of messiness of thinking in a way, I guess there are always examples that you could use to counter that. You know, of course, some poets write really long, messy, like John Ashbery probably, his poems are about the performance of thinking. But in general, when we think of the lyric poem, which for students is, you know, short, kind of 1 to 2 page, condensed kind of poem, it is sort of sitting in a moment perhaps more, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah.
And I love that ability to condense things, to really boil things down rather than let them bubble along.
Mm-hmm.
Completely mix a metaphor, but
that's okay. You're allowed. Do you feel that those two elements of your writing life are complementary? Are there tensions between them ever for you? That, you know, writing and nonfiction, writing and poetry. How do you balance the actual writing and thinking of those two forms?
Look, I genuinely think the two forms have a lot in common, and that gets a bit overlooked sometimes. You know, I think they're both forms that don't necessarily have narrative or narrative logic as the thing driving them through. It's a kind of logic of resonance or echoes or images or a kind of imagistic logic that pulls you through. And I think the kind of attention to language can be really similar too. And, you know, I'm always getting in trouble for my really long sentences in my prose, but it's because I like the rhythm of them, you know, which I get from being a poet. You know, but I do the time that they've been in the most tension, I think, is when I was writing the last essay book, The World Was Whole. Mm-hmm. And in that book, there's two kinds of essays. There's kind of the more regular ones that I'd already been doing that are more conventional in their form, I guess. And then there are these fragmentary ones that are just about little moments and interactions and kind of small injuries was the way I was thinking about them. I wanted them to be a way to kind of chart what it actually means on a day-to-day basis to live with a chronic illness and what happens when that kind of bumps up against the world and the stupid shit that people say to you, really. But I also think of them, they're almost like little prose poems and they kind of all build up together and they're structured in a kind of bioaccrual, I guess. But I felt like the energy of those pieces and the kind of materiality of them or the material they were drawing on better was stuff that I would probably normally be writing poems about. So I didn't write any poetry at all when I was working on those because I felt like it was cannibalizing.
You were rolling it into the essay project.
Yeah.
That's great. Look, I'm all for sneaking poetry into to other forms wherever you can.
I've got to admit, that was kind of one of the things I really like too. I'm just, these people think they're buying a prose book, but you know,
poetry. I mean, I think I wonder, and it's maybe, you know, something for an essay or a speculative kind of research project. But I'm thinking of also Claudia Rankine. I do think that, you know, there is a kind of poet essayist hybrid emerging in these kinds of works where, you know, in the Rankine book, for students who haven't read it, you'll encounter it, I think, in your second year in my Dangerous Ideas courses. But you know, in that text, you have essays about pretty fully fledged essays. The one I'm thinking, the one on Serena Williams is basically an essay. And then you have poems and visual art and intertexts and sort of found poetry, all kind of colliding in this hybrid genre. Anyway, that's I guess maybe an emergent kind of mode or connection between poetry and nonfiction.
I've always thought too that in America the term lyric essay gets used a lot more than it does here, and I'm fascinated by that term because I think it points directly to that overlap and that kind of strange poetic that can be going on too.
Lyric essay, I like that. I mean, lyric in Australia sometimes is conceived of as a pejorative term, but you know, it has so many resonances and it is just such an established kind of mode in Australian poetry and thinking, but also, as you say, potentially in Australian prose as well. Now, I'm just cognizant of time and I want to actually get to the
Okay.
book that we're here to discuss, because I could actually ask you about this stuff forever, but the students will be fascinated to hear about Domestic Interior. It's such a superb book, and congratulations on it, and congratulations on your shortlisting for the Prime Minister's Prize. It is such a terrific book. I wanted to start by asking, so we looked last week in the unit that the students are studying at some of the traditions around landscape and poetry in Australian literature, and, you know, stretching back to sort of settler conceptions of Australian landscape. And, you know, predominantly, I think, I've been thinking about this because I'm writing a chapter about it at the moment, Australian literature, when it thinks of landscape, thinks of the natural world. And that has been the kind of the grappling that's taken place. But Domestic Interior is a really interesting text because it adopts not only the urban, but at times the sort of deliberately ugly suburban, you know, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, you're sort of deliberately choosing things like shopping malls and, you know, these places that potentially people would think of as unpoetic. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role that setting and place plays, because it's so central in this text to me.
And I think it's really central to a lot of my work too, and I think that really comes from having grown up in deepest, darkest suburbia was the joke I used to always make until I realised I was being a bit of a wanker. You know, but I grew up in a very, very suburban part of Sydney, kind of an hour and a half from the city. I like to say that to people from smaller cities because it just, you know, say that to someone.
In Brisbane, you'd be past the Gold Coast if you drive an hour and a half, so I get it. Yeah, it's a sprawl. Yeah.
And you know, I always had this narrative in my head that I wasn't, you know, I wasn't right in this place. I was going to move on to like bigger and more interesting things in the inner suburbs which is, you know, where I live now. And I kind of fully believed that, and then sort of much later realised that this is a story that is embedded in so much Australian writing about suburbs. But also a lot of the work that we were doing in that Western Sydney writing group was about place and about making a literature that was of the place as well as just from the place. And that meant writing about places, you know, like Parramatta, like Bankstown. These mean nothing to you guys, do they? But writing about places that or writing from places is probably better, places that are normally written about by journalists who are coming in to report on, you know, drug dealing or Middle Eastern crime gangs or you know, kind of stuff like that. So we were very focused on writing kind of counter narratives about what it's like to actually be there and live there, and the different kinds of stories that exist there too, given that it's such a diverse region. So I always sort of had that in the back of my mind, and while I was writing Domestic Interior, I was doing a lot of research into suburbs and suburbs in poetry too, and the different ways that poets have tended to react to them, and writers as well, I guess, that we either have this narrative of the place that you must escape because it's boring and stultifying and homogenous and dull, and that's what's going to make your soul if you stay there, or this place that brings out the very best in all of us because it's homes, it's community, it's you know, 2.3 kids in a double garage, and it's kind of a nest or something like that. So either a kind of glorification or a complete dismissal. And of course it can't be either of those things because nothing's simple. So I really wanted to look at those spaces with a bit more complexity, and that kind of looks for the poetry in them and looks for the lives that are in there, and try to bring just a little bit of attention to them, I suppose.
Which I think you do so brilliantly. I mean, listening to you, I'm thinking of a few things. For some reason, Muriel's wedding popped into my head.
Yeah.
That idea of that. No, I mean, it's that fleeing, isn't it? And, you know,
Yes.
I think about that because, you know, I'm from Surfers Paradise, which is what that film is based on. And, you know, the whole, that sort of mythos of having to escape the stultifying, kind of suffocating Australian, you know, the banality of the Australian kind of suburb.
And it's like if real life happens elsewhere, real life doesn't happen
here.
Yeah,
that's right. And then the other thing I sort of thought of was Derek Walcott, the poet and Nobel laureate, for students who don't know him, Caribbean poet who's just recently passed away, had a great line where he said something like, in terms of honesty, you know, writers can only really write within the perimeter of about 20 miles from where they live, which I think is really lovely. And, you know, Walcott made a huge kind of, you know, imagined space out of quite a small island, really. And, you know, you sort of think, actually, when you do pay attention to the things that are closest to you that you know best, but you pay a kind of writerly attention, not just a, you know, impatient everyday attention, when you actually think about them and theorise them. Les Murray is the same, you know, looking at what might seem like a small rural kind of setting, but it can transform into something so large when you pay that kind of attention, can't it?
Yeah. I'm glad the shopping centres. That was one that I was really keen to like.
I love that, Miranda Fair. I was thinking, you know, is it an Australian thing to call shopping centres fairs? I think it must be,
isn't it?
Because there's, you know, in Queensland there's Pacific Fair and there's Australia Fair. It's very anyway.
It's weird.
It's weird. We can discuss that later. I'm just looking at my notes because there were other things I wanted to make sure that I asked you. Oh, right. So do you think then that you're deliberately writing against those kinds of traditions of, you know, thinking about Australia in terms of its natural landscape?
I think it's yes.
Partially, It's a deliberate kind of.
That's not been my experience of this country. I mean, I've been on plenty of holidays through those spaces and have family. You know, my mum's from a country family originally. And we used to do so many driving holidays to look at big things. Like my family were those people.
The big prawn and the big pineapple.
Big pineapple.
Big banana. Have you seen the big banana? Yep. It's not that big, the big banana. I was disappointed. So I want to ask you particularly about, because the students are looking really quite closely at the Tupperware sonnets in this text. I wanted to ask a little bit about how you wrote those poems, what the sort of idea of that sequence was.
I originally tried to write those as short stories.
Oh, interesting.
Just a short story with like little bits, but you know, again with the short fiction thing, it didn't work. And I wrote those after going to a very weird Tupperware party. I didn't know they still existed, for one thing. And it was this really lovely but very strange environment where it was this group of friends, and they were sort of taking it in turns to host, because you get all these presents when you host. And there was a bonus if you convinced one of your friends to hold one themselves.
Oh, God.
So they were kind of, it was like a chain letter gone mad.
It's like a pyramid scheme. It's like a Ponzi scheme.
Yep. And I really didn't know any of the people there. I'd gone as a favour to my friend. I mean, some favour that turned out to be, right? But because they'd all been to a few of these in quick succession, they all had the language down pat, and it was the language of it that really fascinated me. You know, like hearing people say happy chopper, happy chopper, happy chopper, happy chopper, happy chopper, happy chopper over and over again.
It's just bizarre. What is a happy chopper? Is it like a something you plug in and it chops?
No, it's got it's like it's funny, like my dad's got a similar thing for chopping onions. It's got like a blade in it.
And you
or you twist it or something and it chops the stuff that you put in the bottom there. But it also struck me that it was such a, like, Tupperware is such a symbol of suburbia, like lawnmowers, like Hills hoists. You know, it's such a loaded image with so much kind of history attached to it in a way.
And that kind of freight of like the Stepford wives, the 50s kind of conceptions of womanhood where you have to have a gadget for everything in the kitchen, and you know that in some way selfhood is that your worth is determined by the sort of tidiness and the cleanliness, and it's fascinating, isn't it, that still endures in this way.
There was something kind of also really lovely in it that these women were all friends, and you know,
that's right, social, isn't it?
And just hanging out, and they were also keenly aware of how silly it was,
right. But I mean, the question I have, which is not a literary one, but is just a practical one, like, if you are constantly in a group of friends who keeps hosting Tupperware parties, doesn't there reach a logical endpoint where you've got enough Tupperware? Like, is that a stupid question? You know, you must at some point you must have everything that you need at some point.
Yeah.
So when you so you went to this party and you were amused and horrified and that spectrum of emotions about and
also because it's a type of homemaking and womanhood that is not mine.
Right.
You know, I do not want a husband and 2.3 kids. You know, but it was also, but it's not my life, but it was really interesting to me that there was this whole other world and these lives kind of lived in this way, where these people were, you know, happy and interested and engaged, and you know, all of those sorts of things. I think, you know, honourable lives that were just also very different from mine. And I wanted to make them. I decided to make them sonnets because I wanted to, because they've got their history of love poems attached to them too. So I wanted to make it weird, and think of it as a sort of love poem to this particular sense of ritual and space and those kinds of things. And I also, I mean, you must find this too, that one of the lovely things about writing in forms, which I don't do that often, or writing with constraints, is that it really forces you to think a little bit differently, and to hold your material differently than when you're writing more of the free verse stuff that I normally do.
I mean, it's sort of suitable, isn't it, in a poem about containers to pick a kind of containment for your lines. You know, I was thinking that they are sort of like, you know, Tupperware containers where you can fit what you can fit in them, but no more.
Yeah. And the rest of it, you know, I don't know what you do with the rest of it.
You happy chop it or something.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about? I'm always fascinated about how about the shape of the manuscript and the way poets order books and how they conceive of. You know, whether they have sections or not, how they order their poems, and the trajectory or the shape of the manuscript. Could you talk a little bit about how you approached Domestic Interior? Did you have ideas in mind as you were writing it, or was it sort of look at all the poems I've got and then, you know, work from there?
It was much more of a look at what I've got and what's there kind of thing. Usually my approach, because I'm not very good at being strategic in my writing, for better or for worse. I mean, it would be great, save a lot of time, but I also think it wouldn't be as much fun. So I really I think the book is really mostly organised by place in a large part. That, you know, that the first section are the kind of outer suburban poems, and then there's the inner suburban poems, and then the poems from elsewhere. And then the last, you know, so that kind of made a logical sense to me to organise those bits by place. And I guess the last two sections were really the newer poems, and they didn't seem to fit as neatly into those places, or it unbalanced the book. Is probably a better way of putting it. If they were still organised by place, that you had, you know, would have had these very long sections and very short sections, and the rhythm of it didn't feel right, which is why I went thematic for those two. And those ones are mostly set in the inner suburbs as well. And other suburbs too. But I sort of thought of them as being about those kinds of, here are the stories that take place in these places. Because it's one thing to describe a place and all of its physicality and to pay attention to its details and those sorts of things, but I also wanted there to be a kind of reckoning with what happens in these ordinary spaces, that however ordinary a place looks, the experience of being there is extraordinary, and people are going through extraordinary things there. So I guess they're the kind of extreme bits stuck on the end.
I mean, I absolutely love the section A Crack in the Skin on illness. Without prying or anything like that, I just wondered if you could talk about, if you feel comfortable, the act of writing what conceivably are confessional poems or poems about what presumably is, difficult subject matter. I'm always fascinated at the poets, and I try and do it myself, but often pull back from confessing everything. It's sort of fascinating, and they're such beautiful. Sorry? I
feel like you're much more oblique in the way that you put personal stuff in. It kind of the poems sort of glance off it.
Yeah, and I'm interested because you're able to kind of, not in every poem, obviously, and it's one section of the book, but when you can, you kind of are able to speak quite directly. And I wonder if you talk, I'm thinking of, students who'll be watching this who will have their own experiences with various, difficult life experiences, illness, other kinds of, traumas, things like that. I wonder if you're comfortable, if you'd be able to talk a little bit about how it is to write about that and how you conceive of it when you write about it, and how you, I suppose, find the distance to think of it as a poem rather than, a confession or turn it into something literary.
It's funny. I always kind of balk a little bit at the word confession. I know it's kind of got its literary history attached to it, but to me it can't escape its kind of religious origins. That like if you're confessing something,
because it's embarrassing or sin. Yeah,
it's sinful. But I think the way they came about, the reason I started doing that sort of writing is I've always had the kind of feeling I have when I know I'm going to write a poem, or when I know I'm going to write anything really, is that there's something that's happened, or some feeling that I have, or some image that is sort of stuck in the back of my brain, and I can't shake it. And sort of writing about it is really a process of trying to understand what it is that makes it sticky. Like what's the part of it that's obsessing me, or that is difficult, or that I can't shake off. And normally you discover that when you write, which is like one of the most joyous things about it, I think. Which is really selfish in a way. It helps me. But it kind of gives me a way to untangle whatever it is that's going on, or to kind of deal with that excessive emotion. I've always been a person with big feels, and you can kind of siphon some of them off this way. And it can be hard to do, because it does mean you have to be willing to be honest, because I think readers can tell straight away if you're
dishonest,
lies, or eliding something important, or skirting around the actual heart of the matter. And there's a difference between being honest and telling everyone everything. You can still withhold what's personal and what's private, and you can withhold a lot too if you want to. But I've always found the writing a really good way to deal with hard stuff, which is not to say it's therapy. Therapy's therapy. If you need therapy, get therapy. If you don't need therapy, get therapy. It's good for you.
Right.
Because I get asked a lot by men mostly if the writing is therapeutic or if the writing is therapy, and I'm like, it's not therapy, but it is therapeutic. Is kind of the.
I think that's right. I mean, I there was a time where sort of 10, 15 years ago, writing as therapy was a big kind of topic for research in kind of creative writing studies, cultural studies. And I think you're right. It doesn't replace therapy, but it is beneficial and therapeutic. And
I think it helps you figure out what you're thinking and feeling, and it also turns what you're thinking and feeling into a discrete object that you can look at and hold and put over there, which may not be healthy. I don't know.
So how do you, in that, I mean, how do you then, and this is something I know that students struggle with, gaining the distance that's required once you have written that object to edit it as though it's anything else, as though it's a poem about something external. I think sometimes the most personal things can be the most difficult to gain distance, the editorial distance from. Do you struggle with that?
I think the biggest problem I tend to have is I feel like when something is very personal, the bit where you kill your darlings can be harder because those bits just mean
so
more
much
to you,
right?
So ruthlessness is important. And I also think paying attention to language is a great way out of that. Like if you're a writer who part of the challenge and part of the joy of it is not just finding a way to express this, but finding a beautiful way to express this, or finding a melodic way to express this, or a rhythmic way to express this, then really hooking into the language as much as the subject matter can be a really great way to pull back like that.
And I think, bearing in mind that there's an audience on the end of this who doesn't have those emotions attached to the topic, so you have to kind of use the poem in a way to get them to that place.
Yeah, and often I think if the problem is not having enough distance, then other people can be your best resource too. Other writers, workshopping, editors, that kind of stuff, because they can tell you the bits that you haven't explained properly because you're carrying your preconceived knowledge of what's going on. And they're very good at pointing out flaws in your logic, I've found, which are often sometimes hard to see because it's your own brain. Because your own brain is faultless.
Yeah, I know. Are you still part of the same writing group, or do you now rely on editors more, or do you still have peers that you share drafts with?
I do still have peers. It's not the same group. That group's doing sort of very different work now. It's kind of morphed into a space that works a lot with writers of colour from the area, which I think is really important.
Is that Sweatshop?
Yeah. And Felicity Castagna is running a group for women in the area too, called Finishing School, which is great because there are bigger barriers of access for women out there, as we say. But I just recently, so I've always had a poetry group sort of separate from that too, who I forgot to mention, and I've recently started another group for prose stuff too, which has been really helpful actually. And I love workshop groups partly because it's a good excuse to hang out and eat cheese and drink wine.
I know it is. It's a virtuous way to eat cheese and drink wine.
Yeah. But and as well as the way that it helps with your work, which is the important bit. It also keeps you. Here's Cat.
Oh, hello.
All right. There's Cat's bum. Cats are such a dickhead, I swear. What was I saying? Oh yeah, it also helps. I think it's also really important to have writer friends in your life, and just by sheer dint of there we go, of understanding what's going on and what the work is and what the way your brain works and because we are a bit of a rare breed, which is not to say special or anything like that. We're just uncommon.
And the ups and downs of writing can be quite acute, can't they? You know, and I think people just think, you know, look at you and think, oh, she's got 4 books, and you know, they've won prizes and been really well received, and so she'd have, you know, perfect confidence in what she does and just trucks on. And you know, I think this is kind of the perception of people who have established themselves as writers, and it's really not the. I mean, that doubt and that animating kind of anxiety about the work and its caliber and how to do it, and that never really goes away. I mean, there's
and I think it's part of the process too, right? Yeah. Like I think I mean, I don't know a single writer who isn't riven with self-doubt, but I think that's part of what makes you push yourself, and or it's one of the engines of the work too, kind of doubt and worry.
Yeah, doubt and worry. But I mean, I think having that group around you does help assuage that, you know, where you think, oh, this is the worst thing I've ever written, and then someone goes, oh, I really liked that part, and maybe you could do this. Yeah. It's a productive voice, isn't it?
The feeling I get a lot is, okay, I've been working on this for, 2.5 weeks. It's finished. I have no idea if it's any good or not. Right. I just can't tell anymore. So just have other people read it over and be like, no, that makes sense. Yeah. Or, no, you're right, that is a stinking turd of bullshit.
I mean, the other thing it's important to say is it's good to have honest writer friends, not just people who praise what you do. And you know, I think I wonder. I was thinking about the sort of effect of just the changes with social media and the ways in which there are now these digital communities of writers and all that sort of stuff. I do feel as though literature is perhaps slightly more polite than it used to be, and I really love critics. And I really love people who will rip my writing to pieces. I've always been like that. I have absolutely no preciousness about, you know, even if someone ripped my work apart in a review, I would think that was interesting, not devastating. Yes. But I wonder, you know, it's great that you have that kind of group where they will say, this is just can it. But anyway, that's another speculation that's neither to be proved or not. But I do notice there's so much sort of supportiveness, which is lovely. Like, it's great to have supportive communities of writers, but it's also equally important to have that kind of critical side, isn't it?
Yeah. And, you know, not all of them, a lot of the writers in this group are critics as well, right. or publishers, or, you know, like everyone, well, everyone's going to say everyone's wearing 2 hats, but everyone's wearing 3 or 4 hats because that's what we all do.
That's Australian literature, isn't it? We don't have...
That's right.
Many standalone critics who aren't also poets or novelists, or, you know.
And I mean, I think that's great in a way, because it means that your stuff is being assessed by people who know
what it is to write a book.
Yeah, and what the work is.
Right.
I guess, for better or for worse. But you know, sometimes you do get like, this isn't the book I would have written as a.
I know. I mean, I think it's great too, although, you know, sometimes I think, where's Australia's William Logan? Not that I like William Logan. In fact, I hate William Logan. And anyway, I mean, students, you should look him up. Just, your mind will be blown. I mean, he's sort of the original troll. But, you know, I wonder sometimes whether we miss the freedom to be someone like William Logan, who's like a cantankerous, I think he's still alive, American critic, who basically believes that, you know, poetry stopped in the 1800s and everything contemporary is just appalling, and he's written these scathing reviews of just about everyone. But, you know, there is a kind of freedom in having no associations, and, you know, Australian literature can be very kind of complex ecosystem because it is a small world, right? I mean, it's very, very, very small, and everyone kind of knows everyone. And like you say, they might be an editor and a publisher and a writer and a judge. Which leads me, actually, I did want to ask you, because the students also are looking a little bit about the reception of books and I guess the value, or, you know, it's always questionable, the value of prizes and the role prizes play in that kind of perception of a career and so forth. I wonder, your books have been shortlisted or won. I know Small Acts of Disappearance won the Kibble, was shortlisted for the Stella, which is a huge prize. Your most recent book, I know, was shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Literary Awards, among other mentions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about prizes, what they've meant in your career, what you think of them. I mean, people sometimes have a vexed relationship to prizes,
Yeah. More and more, my relationship is becoming more and more vexed. Because, I mean, generally, I think they're wonderful, and I'm glad they exist. And for a couple of reasons, that a shortlisting, really, each shortlisting has meant a lot to me, because I'm so riven with that self-doubt. It's kind of okay. Like,
it's an affirmation, right? Yeah.
It is an affirmation, which is silly, and I should be able to do that for myself, but I can't, so thank you, wider world. And so that's really lovely. And with prizes like Stella in particular, one of the things I love about that prize is they do a lot of work for everybody on the shortlist and really work on promoting all of those books. So that prize really helped. It really kind of gave my career quite a bump, I think. That it was shortly after that prize that I felt like I didn't have to work as hard to ask people to let me write for them.
Yeah.
And even some people were being like, "Hey, would you like to write for us?"
Yeah.
Which took a bit of adjusting to get used to, but I don't think that would have happened without the kind of I don't want to say publicity machine of that prize, because that sounds really like cynical and nasty, but
I think it's great. I think it is a publicity machine, and I think they do a fantastic job.
Yeah. But it's great in a way, because we don't have many
people
things like that
promoting books. Yeah.
And especially, my publisher's a small literary publisher. They don't have a marketing team or anything like that. The other thing that's really great is that prizes can make a substantial difference to your next year, at least.
To your bank balance.
Money is time to write. It's time that you don't have to wear as many of your other hats. You can just put your main one on for a little while. And I think all of that's wonderful. The vexing part is that on any shortlist, someone's going to have a really great year next year, but they only have to wear one hat.
Right.
And, might be able to pay off a couple of their loans. Or I bought a dog with my first prize money.
Oh, that's a great investment.
Best decision I ever made. I mean, it was called Kibble. What are you going to do? But 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 other people are going to walk away without their lives being transformed. And most now, more and more, the prizes aren't letting people know beforehand.
No, I know.
Which I think is heinous and cruel, because everyone's like standing around awkwardly at this dinner full of emotion.
I know. I know. I do know. I have been on both sides of that kind of interaction. It's I think that they think it's like the Oscars, but it's just not. No.
And the other thing is that, having judged a few things too, and having close friends who've judged things, you learn very quickly how these small decisions go into the big decision, and how any one of the books could win. And it can be Judge A really liked book A, Judge B really liked book B, so book C was a good compromise. It can or it can have to do with the history of that prize and what it's done in the past, or there are so many other factors that go into them aside from literary merit, because how do you judge that between such strange and different books anyway? So that was a very long answer to quite a simple question.
No, I think it is a very complex thing, and even things like sometimes a writer's success in the past can be a problem for them, in judging. You know, sometimes people say, oh, well, you know, he's 80 and he's won so many prizes. Why don't we give it to an emerging writer? You know, I mean, which is a nice sentiment, but if it's the best book, I think, yeah, it's fascinating how movable it is. I think, having done a bit of judging myself too, I feel quite mollified by that idea, though, that you know, really it can be any of the books, and the kind of boon is to be shortlisted. I do think it's nice when they give money to the shortlist. There's a few prizes that do that, and I think that should be the case for all prizes, especially if you're asking people to fly there and you don't know whether you're going to win, and so on and so forth. I do think that's quite nice. But yeah, I share your kind of skepticism. You know, what it's not a final decision on what is actually the best book. It's just an acknowledgement of one, you know, and of all of them, really. But yeah, it's complex, isn't it? Now, I'm cognizant that we've actually hit our hour. Amazingly, it went by like that. I think I asked pretty much all of my questions. I am so grateful to you, Fiona. You've been so generous in giving your time. I know that for the students, this will just be a really extraordinary chance to hear, after having read your book and studied your book and thought about you as an author and your career, to hear your reflections will be just so invaluable. And so I'm really, really grateful.